The hangar smelled like jet fuel and old mistakes. Nobody noticed the woman in the faded leather jacket standing near the maintenance bay, hands in her pockets, watching the F-18 Super Hornets being prepped for the morning sortie. She didn't look like much, 5'6", maybe 130 pounds, with silver streaking through dark hair pulled into a careless ponytail. The flight suit she wore had no patches, no insignia, nothing that marked her as anyone important. Just another contractor, maybe. Or a has-been trying to relive glory days. The young sergeant didn't even look up when he shoved past her, his shoulder connecting hard enough to send her stumbling sideways into the corrugated metal wall. "Watch it," he snapped, not bothering to turn around. His tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. Behind him, 3 other junior officers laughed, the sound echoing off the hangar's vaulted ceiling. One of them made a comment about civilians needing to stay out of operational areas. The woman said nothing. She straightened, rolled her shoulder once, and kept watching the flight line. Her eyes pale gray, the color of storm clouds over open water, tracked the ordnance being loaded onto the aircraft with the kind of focus that suggested she was counting rivets, calculating payload distribution, measuring fuel capacity by sight alone. What they didn't know, what nobody in that hangar knew yet, was that in exactly 17 minutes, the base commander would walk through those doors. In 19 minutes, every officer present would be called to attention. And in 20 minutes, the woman with no patches and silver-streaked hair would be introduced as Vice Admiral Kestrel Vance, the Navy's newest 3-star, former Top Gun instructor, and the officer who'd just been given operational command of the entire Atlantic Fleet's air wing. The woman who'd logged more carrier landings than anyone currently serving. The pilot who'd earned the call sign, Widow, not because she'd lost a husband, but because she'd shot down 7 enemy aircraft in a single engagement over the Strait of Hormuz, and walked away when her entire squadron hadn't. But right now, in this moment, she was just a woman who'd been shoved into a wall by a sergeant who'd never learned that eagles don't announce themselves. They just fly higher than everyone else expects. Kestrel's fingers traced the old scar along her collarbone, the one shaped like a lightning bolt, a gift from a cockpit fire that should have killed her. She smiled faintly, watching the sergeant swagger toward the ready room, oblivious. Some lessons, she thought, could only be learned the hard way. The morning sun cut through the eastern windows, painting everything gold. 23 years ago, Kestrel Vance had been the only woman in a flight school class of 47 men. They'd called her Canary, fragile, decorative, destined to die in the mines of naval aviation. She'd endured the casual sexism, the deliberate isolation, the way instructors called on her less and doubted her more. Her first squadron assignment had been to a carrier strike group deploying to the Persian Gulf, and the squadron commander had made it clear she was there to fill a diversity quota, nothing more. He'd given her the worst aircraft, the least desirable patrol routes, the missions nobody wanted. She'd flown them all without complaint, without asking for anything, without expecting mercy. It was during her second deployment that everything changed. The mission had been routine reconnaissance, 2 F-18s shadowing an Iranian patrol boat near international waters. Kestrel had been flying wing, following her lead's every move when the radar lit up. Bogies, 7 of them, MiG-29s fast and aggressive, vectoring directly toward the American aircraft. Her wingman's voice had crackled over the radio. "Widow 2, we're outnumbered. Recommend we bug out." But Kestrel had done the math. If they ran, the MiGs would pursue, possibly into the carrier group's defensive perimeter. If they engaged, they'd buy time. She'd toggled her radio. "Widow lead negative, we hold." What happened next became legend. Kestrel had maneuvered her F-18 like she was dancing with death itself, using terrain masking, speed, and angles the enemy couldn't predict. She'd baited the MiGs into a canyon where their numbers meant nothing, where their superior radar couldn't lock through the mountainous interference. One by one, she'd taken them down. 3 with missiles, 4 with guns, because her payload had run dry and turning back wasn't an option. When she'd landed on the carrier deck 90 minutes later, fuel indicators showing zeros, hydraulics failing, airframe shaking apart. The deck crew had found bullet holes stitching the fuselage, a cracked canopy, and a pilot whose hands wouldn't stop trembling even after she'd climbed out. Her wingman hadn't made it back. 7 enemy kills, 1 loss, and a call sign that would follow her forever. Widow. Now she stood in this hangar, decades later, watching young pilots who didn't know their own history. The sergeant who'd shoved her was laughing with his friends near the coffee station, completely unaware. Kestrel checked her watch. 15 minutes until the commander arrived. She wondered if she should say something now, intervene, offer the boy a chance to apologize before his career imploded. But she'd learned long ago that some people needed to face consequences unfiltered. Mercy, she discovered, wasn't always kind. Commander Price entered through the main doors exactly on schedule, flanked by 2 aides and the base's senior master chief. His face was already set in that expression of forced enthusiasm commanders wore when introducing someone they hadn't wanted to meet. Kestrel understood. She'd been inserted into this command by someone higher up the chain, someone who decided the Atlantic Fleet needed shaking up. Price had expected another old boy, someone he could golf with and manage. Instead, he'd gotten her, a woman with a reputation for firing incompetent officers and rebuilding squadrons from scratch. Someone who actually read after-action reports and noticed when maintenance schedules were falsified. Someone who'd flown combat missions more recently than most of his staff had been alive. "Attention on deck," the Master Chief's voice boomed through the hangar. Every sailor and officer snapped to attention, including the sergeant, whose smile vanished as he registered the commander's presence. Kestrel didn't move. She remained where she was, leaning against the wall, watching. Price's eyes found her across the hangar. He looked pained. She offered him the smallest nod, not quite sympathetic, not quite amused. Price cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Vice Admiral Kestrel Vance, who will be assuming operational command of all Atlantic Fleet air operations effective immediately." Admiral Vance has an exemplary record spanning 3 decades, including combat leadership in multiple theaters and a distinguished teaching career at Top Gun. She'll be conducting readiness assessments across all squadrons starting today. The silence that followed was profound. Kestrel pushed off the wall, straightened her flight suit, and walked toward the front of the hangar. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd already survived everything these people could throw at her. The sergeant's face had gone white. His friends looked like they'd swallowed glass. As she passed them, Kestrel didn't acknowledge them at all. That was the thing about real power. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply was. She reached Commander Price and extended her hand. "Commander, thank you for the warm welcome." Her voice carried that particular quality of someone who'd spent years projecting authority over radio static and engine noise, clear, measured, impossible to ignore. Price shook her hand, his grip uncertain. "Admiral, we've prepared a briefing in the operations center. Your quarters are ready and we've assembled the squadron leaders for your review." Kestrel nodded. "Appreciated. But first I'd like to walk the flight line, get a feel for the operation. I'm sure everyone here has work to do." It wasn't a dismissal exactly, but people scattered anyway, the way sailors do when an admiral suggests they might be standing around. Within 30 seconds, the hangar was a flurry of activity. The sergeant remained frozen, his career flashing before his eyes. Kestrel finally turned to look at him. Up close, he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 23, with the kind of confidence that came from never being challenged. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What's your name, Sergeant?" Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. He stammered. "Sergeant Marcus Webb, ma'am. She held up one hand, cutting him off. "Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant Webb. You're going to report to the Master Chief and request additional training on professional conduct and spatial awareness. You're going to write a detailed analysis of today's incident, including what you could have done differently. And you're going to think very carefully about how you treat people whose rank you haven't verified. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't know." "No," Kestrel said, her voice dropping to something harder, colder. You didn't care, there's a difference. You saw someone you thought was beneath you and you acted accordingly. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Now get out of my sight." Webb fled. His friends had already disappeared. Kestrel watched him go, then turned to find Commander Price studying her with something like respect. "You could have destroyed him," Price observed quietly. Kestrel shrugged. "He's young. He'll learn or he won't. Either way, he's not my problem unless he makes himself one again." She glanced around the hangar, taking in the aircraft, the equipment, the faces of the sailors trying not to stare. "Tell me about readiness, Commander. The real numbers, not what's in the reports." Price hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Readiness is below standard, Admiral. We've got maintenance backlogs, personnel shortages, and morale issues. The last two commanders prioritized political appearances over operational capability. We look good on paper. In reality, half these birds couldn't sustain a real combat deployment beyond 72 hours. Kestrel nodded slowly. It was what she'd expected, what she'd been sent here to fix. "Show me the worst squadron first," she said. "The one everyone's given up on, we'll start there." Price actually smiled. "You're going to fit in just fine, Admiral, this way." As they walked toward the operations center, Kestrel felt the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders, the weight of command, of responsibility, of being the person who had to make impossible decisions. It was heavy. It had always been heavy. But that morning in the Persian Gulf, when she turned toward 7 enemy fighters instead of running, she'd learned something fundamental about herself. She'd learned that fear was just information, not instruction. That survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being unwilling to quit even when quitting made sense. She'd earned the call sign Widow that day, earned it in blood and fire and the screaming certainty of her own imminent death. And she'd kept earning it every day since, in 1,000 small ways, by showing up and doing the work nobody else wanted to do. The operations center was exactly what she'd expected: too many monitors, not enough maintenance, coffee stains on classified documents. The squadron leaders assembled there looked tired, cynical, worn down by bureaucracy and budget cuts. They'd probably expected another glad-handing political appointee, someone who'd give inspiring speeches and then disappear to Washington. Kestrel took her position at the head of the conference table and waited for everyone to settle. She didn't introduce herself. Price had done that. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she pulled up the readiness reports on the main screen and studied them in silence for 30 seconds. Then she pointed to a specific line. "Who falsified this maintenance log?" The room went silent. One of the squadron commanders, a lieutenant commander with too much gel in his hair, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, those logs were approved by—" Kestrel's eyes cut to him. "I didn't ask who approved them. I asked who falsified them. This aircraft supposedly underwent a complete engine overhaul on Tuesday, but the parts requisition shows the replacement turbine wasn't even delivered until Thursday. So either we've achieved time travel or someone signed off on work that wasn't done. Which is it?" The lieutenant commander's face reddened. Kestrel waited. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, he broke. "It's standard practice, ma'am. We're under pressure to maintain readiness numbers. If we report actual status, we lose funding, so we smooth the numbers." Kestrel set down her tablet carefully, deliberately. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to explain something to you very clearly. When I was flying combat missions, I trusted my maintenance crew with my life, every single flight. I trusted that when they told me an aircraft was ready, it was actually ready. That trust is sacred. It's the foundation of everything we do. You just admitted to me that you've been lying about aircraft readiness, which means you've been risking pilots' lives to protect your funding numbers. Do you understand how serious that is?" He stammered something about regulations and pressures from above. Kestrel cut him off with a gesture. "You're relieved of command, effective immediately. Report to Commander Price's office for reassignment. Get out." The lieutenant commander stood, his face a mixture of shock and anger. For a moment it looked like he might argue. Then he saw Kestrel's expression, cold, final, utterly without sympathy, and thought better of it. He left. The room remained silent. The other squadron leaders looked like they were reevaluating their life choices. Kestrel let the moment breathe. Then she turned to the rest of them. Anyone else have something they need to confess? Any other creative paperwork I should know about? Nobody spoke. She nodded. Good. Here's how this is going to work. Starting immediately, we report actual readiness. Real numbers. If aircraft aren't mission capable, we say so. If we have personnel problems, we document them. If maintenance is behind schedule, we acknowledge it. I'd rather have an honest 50% readiness rate than a fictional 90%, because honest numbers let us fix real problems. Fiction just gets people killed. One of the older squadron leaders, a commander with gray at his temples and crow's feet that suggested he'd spent too many years squinting at hostile radar screens, raised his hand slightly. Kestrel nodded to him. Admiral, with respect, the people above you aren't going to like honest numbers. They're going to want to know why readiness dropped overnight. Kestrel smiled thinly. Let me worry about the people above me, Commander. That's what they pay me for. Your job is to take care of your pilots and your aircraft. In that order, can you do that? He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, we can do that. She studied him for a moment. What's your name, Commander? He straightened. Commander James Reeves, ma'am. I run the VFA 103 Jolly Rogers. Kestrel's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something warmer than the ice she'd shown the lieutenant commander. Reeves, you flew with Bill Cortez, didn't you? Back in the late 90s. Reeves looked startled. Yes, ma'am, he was my first squadron co. How did you? Kestrel interrupted gently. Bill and I went through Top Gun together. He spoke highly of you, said you were one of the best natural pilots he'd ever trained, said you should have been running your own squadron years ago. She paused. He also said the system had a way of overlooking people who didn't play politics. Looks like he was right. Reeves's expression complicated: surprise, gratitude, old grief. Bill was killed in a training accident, ma'am. 5 years ago, bad maintenance on a T-45, hydraulic failure on final approach. The room went very quiet. Kestrel's face showed nothing, but something flickered behind her eyes: recognition, understanding, shared loss. I know, she said softly. I was at his funeral. I didn't speak, wasn't invited to, but I was there. She looked around the conference table, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. That's why I'm here. That's why I fire people who falsify maintenance logs and smooth numbers. Because Bill Cortez was one of the best pilots I ever knew, and he died because someone somewhere decided paperwork was more important than truth. I will not let that happen again. Not under my command. Not to my pilots. Is that clear? The chorus of "Yes, ma'am" was immediate and genuine. Something had shifted in the room. They'd walked in expecting another political officer. They were realizing they'd gotten something different. Someone who'd been where they were. Someone who'd buried friends. Someone who understood that aviation wasn't about funding reports and readiness statistics. It was about bringing people home alive. Kestrel checked her watch. It's 800. I want updated, honest readiness reports on my desk by 1600 today. Commander Reeves, you're acting Deputy Air Wing Commander until I find someone permanent. Commander Price, schedule individual meetings with each squadron leader, 30 minutes each, starting tomorrow. I want to know what's really happening out there. And someone get me the maintenance chief. We need to talk about culture change. They filed out, leaving Kestrel alone in the operations center. She stood at the window overlooking the flight line, watching an F-18 taxi toward the runway. The morning sun painted the aircraft's canopy gold, making it look like something from a dream. Kestrel remembered that feeling, the moment before takeoff, when the world contracted to just you and the machine and the sky ahead. The moment when everything became simple. Fly, survive, come home. Her hand found the scar on her collarbone again, tracing its familiar shape. The doctors had wanted to fix it, make it invisible. She'd refused. Scars, she'd learned, were just proof you'd survived something that should have killed you. They were credentials written in tissue and time. In a world that constantly demanded she prove herself, her scars were the only testimony she needed. Behind her, Commander Price entered quietly. That was quite a show, Admiral. Words already spreading through the base. You fired Harrison before you'd been here an hour. Kestrel didn't turn. Lieutenant Commander Harrison earned that firing long before I arrived. I just made it official. Tell me, Commander, how long have you known about the falsified logs? Price hesitated. She could hear him weighing honesty against self-preservation. Finally, 3 months, maybe longer. I pushed back, but the pressure from Fleet Command was intense. They wanted good numbers for the upcoming appropriations cycle. I convinced myself it was a necessary evil, a way to protect the air wing long-term. Kestrel finally turned to face him. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm wondering if Bill Cortez would still be alive if more people had been willing to be honest instead of convenient. She nodded slowly. That's the right question, Commander. Keep asking it. She moved past him toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad officer. I think you're someone who forgot why he joined the Navy in the first place. But that's fixable. We're going to fix it together, starting now. Price straightened. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Kestrel left him standing there. She had a maintenance chief to terrify and a culture to rebuild. But first, she needed to fly. She always thought more clearly at 20,000 feet, where the air was thin and clean, and the only thing that mattered was the horizon ahead. She requisitioned an F-18 from the duty officer and spent the next 90 minutes alone with the sky. No radio chatter, no mission parameters, just flight in its purest form, speed and altitude and the endless blue. When she landed, Sergeant Webb was waiting near the maintenance bay. He came to attention as she climbed down from the cockpit. Kestrel removed her helmet and studied him. He looked like he'd spent the last 2 hours questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. At ease, Sergeant. What can I do for you? He swallowed hard. Ma'am, I wanted to apologize. Properly. What I did this morning was inexcusable. I was arrogant and careless, and I showed you disrespect based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. I'm ashamed of my behavior and I'm committed to doing better. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I understand the severity of my mistake. It was a good apology, specific, genuine, without excuses. Kestrel appreciated that. Apology accepted, Sergeant Webb. Now let me tell you something important. She stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. You think this morning was about you disrespecting an admiral. It wasn't. It was about you disrespecting another human being. Rank doesn't determine worth, Sergeant. Character does. If you'd shown that same casual cruelty to a contractor or a civilian or anyone else you considered beneath you, the offense would have been identical. Do you understand? He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I do. Kestrel held his gaze a moment longer, then stepped back. Good, now go do your job, and Sergeant, the best apology is changed behavior. Show me you've learned something and will never speak of this again. Relief washed over his face. Thank you, ma'am, I won't let you down. She watched him hurry away, then allowed herself a small smile. Maybe there was hope for this place after all. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, inspections, and uncomfortable conversations. Kestrel tore through the air wing like a controlled wildfire, burning away dead wood and leaving space for new growth. She fired 2 more squadron commanders for incompetence and promoted 3 junior officers who'd been overlooked for years. She reorganized maintenance schedules, secured emergency funding for parts, and personally reviewed every pilot's training records. She flew with each squadron, not as an evaluator but as a wingman, showing them she wouldn't ask them to do anything she couldn't do herself. Slowly, grudgingly, the culture began to shift. Pilots who'd been coasting on reputation found themselves pushed to improve. Maintenance crews who'd been cutting corners discovered they couldn't hide anymore. The honest readiness reports Kestrel had demanded caused exactly the bureaucratic explosion she'd expected. Fleet Command called her daily, demanding explanations. She provided them, calmly and without apology. When a 2-star admiral threatened to have her removed for creating unnecessary problems, Kestrel had simply invited him to visit the base and fly a mission with her. He declined. She'd smiled and told him she'd be happy to continue the conversation when he found his courage. He'd stopped calling. By the end of the month, something remarkable had happened. Readiness numbers had actually started climbing. Not because anyone was falsifying reports, but because honest assessment had revealed real problems that could be fixed. Maintenance backlogs had been addressed, Parts had been secured, training protocols had been updated. The Atlantic Fleet Air Wing still wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was finally moving in the right direction, and the pilots noticed. They stopped referring to her as the new Admiral and started calling her by her call sign, Widow, some with reverence, some with fear. All with respect. Commander Reeves found her in the hangar late one evening, long after most personnel had gone home. She was sitting on a maintenance cart, reading maintenance logs by portable light, making notes in the margins. He approached carefully, announcing himself before he got too close. "Admiral, got a minute?" She looked up, set down her tablet. "Commander, what's on your mind?" He settled onto a nearby cart, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something you said in that first briefing. About trust being sacred, about maintenance crews and pilots relying on each other. I realized I'd forgotten that. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about flying and became about managing budgets and personnel files. I'd stopped thinking of myself as a pilot and started thinking of myself as an administrator." Kestrel nodded slowly. "It happens to everyone who stays in long enough. The system is designed to turn warriors into bureaucrats." Reeves smiled ruefully. "How do you fight that? How do you stay?" She considered the question carefully. "You fly," she said finally. "As often as you can, you remember what it feels like, and you surround yourself with people who won't let you forget why you started doing this in the first place." She paused. "Bill Cortez told me something once years ago. He said the moment you stop being afraid of flying is the moment you should quit, because fear is what keeps you sharp. Respect for the machine, respect for the sky, respect for the physics that'll kill you if you screw up. The day you stop feeling that is the day you become dangerous, not to the enemy but to yourself and everyone around you." Reeves absorbed that. "Is that why you still fly? To stay afraid?" Kestrel laughed quietly. "No, I fly because it's the only place I feel completely honest." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two pilots who'd seen too much and survived anyway, sharing space in a quiet hangar while the world slept. Finally, Reeves stood. "Thank you, Admiral, for coming here, for caring enough to blow everything up. We needed it." She nodded. "Thank you for being willing to rebuild. That's the harder part." After he left, Kestrel remained in the hangar, surrounded by aircraft and the smell of jet fuel. Her phone buzzed, a message from Fleet Command, probably more complaints about her methods. She ignored it, let them complain. She had work to do. Outside, the moon hung low over the ocean, painting everything silver. Somewhere out there in the dark water beyond the continental shelf, submarines prowled. Above them, satellites tracked movements invisible to human eyes. The machinery of defense never slept. 6 months into her command, the call came at 300. Kestrel was already awake. She rarely slept more than 4 hours anymore, reviewing intelligence reports in her quarters when her secure phone rang. The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. "Admiral Vance, this is NORTHCOM operations. We have a developing situation. Russian bomber formation heading toward the ADIZ. Looks like a probing run, but they're coming in hot. We need aircraft airborne in 20 minutes. Kestrel was moving before the caller finished speaking, already pulling on her flight suit. "Understood. I'll have a section airborne in 15. Send me the coordinates." She was out the door before the call ended, running through empty corridors toward the hangar. She hit the alert button as she passed the ready room, triggering klaxons that would wake every pilot on base. Commander Reeves met her at the equipment lockers, already suited up. "Russian bombers?" he asked. She nodded. "For 295, probably testing response times. Standard harassment, but we need to show them we're paying attention." Within 12 minutes, 4 F-18s were taxiing toward the runway. Kestrel took lead in her own aircraft, with Reeves as her wingman and two younger pilots, Lieutenant Jessica Park and Lieutenant Nathan Cross, rounding out the section. The tower cleared them for immediate takeoff. Kestrel pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of acceleration, the moment when the aircraft stopped being a machine and became an extension of her will. They went supersonic 3 minutes after wheels up, racing northeast toward the intercept point. The early morning darkness was absolute, broken only by stars and the glow of their instruments. Kestrel's radar painted the approaching Russians as bright contacts moving south at steady speed. She toggled her radio. Widow flight, this is Widow 1. Targets bearing 045, range 80 miles, altitude 30,000 feet. We'll make a standard intercept, close to visual range, establish presence, escort them out of the ADIZ. Weapons tight unless I give explicit clearance. Acknowledge. 3 voices confirmed. Kestrel adjusted her course slightly, calculating intercept angles in her head. The Russians would see them coming on radar, would know American fighters were vectoring toward them. This was the game, predictable, almost choreographed, but deadly serious. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and the situation could spiral into something nobody wanted. At 40 miles, Kestrel began her approach. The Russian formation resolved into 4 distinct contacts, massive Tu-95 Bear bombers, Cold War relics still capable of carrying enough ordnance to level a city. They were flying in loose formation, maintaining course, making no attempt to evade. Provocative but not overtly hostile. Kestrel brought her F-18 alongside the lead bomber, close enough to see the rivets on its fuselage, the glow of cockpit lights through the windows. Inside, Russian aircrew would be watching her, taking photographs, probably laughing at the American response. She didn't care. She was sending a message, we see you, we're here, turn around. For 3 long minutes, they flew in parallel, American fighters bracketing Russian bombers, the 2 Cold War adversaries dancing in the sky like they'd done 1,000 times before. Then, as expected, the lead Russian aircraft began a slow turn north. Kestrel matched the turn, maintaining position. The message had been received. The bombers would retreat beyond the ADIZ, file a diplomatic protest, and everyone would pretend this was unusual. Standard procedure. Except this time, something was different. As the formation turned, Kestrel's radar warning receiver screamed, targeting radar. Active, sweeping across her aircraft with the unmistakable signature of a weapons system achieving lock. Her training took over instantly. Widow flight, break, evasive maneuvers. She rolled hard right, punching chaff and flares, her aircraft screaming through a series of violent turns designed to break any missile lock. Her mind raced. The Russians shouldn't be doing this. This wasn't part of the game. Unless the game had changed. Behind her, Park's voice came through tense and controlled. Widow 1, I'm spiked. Active radar lock. Kestrel's blood went cold. Multiple targeting radars meant this wasn't an accident or a malfunction. This was deliberate. The Russians were simulating an attack, pushing the envelope far beyond normal protocols, testing American response not to their presence but to actual threat. She made a decision in the space between heartbeats. Widow flight, maintain defensive posture but do not go weapons hot. Reeves, get on guard frequency. Tell those Russian pilots they're dangerously close to an international incident. Park, cross, stay with me. We're going to show them we're not afraid, but we're not taking the bait either. Reeves's voice crackled back. Widow 1, they're not responding to hails. Either they can't hear us or they're ignoring us. Kestrel's jaw tightened. Fine. They wanted to play games. She'd show them what a real pilot could do. She brought her F-18 around in a maneuver that would have made her flight instructors proud and her safety officer furious. A high-G turn that put her directly in front of the lead Russian bomber, close enough that her jet wash would shake their aircraft. Close enough that any missile launch would hit her before it could track to anyone else. She held position for 5 seconds, staring through her canopy at the massive bomber's nose, knowing the Russian pilots could see her clearly. Then she rolled inverted, passed directly over their canopy at a distance measured in feet, and pulled away in a climbing spiral that left vapor trails writing her message across the sky, back off. The targeting radars went silent. The Russian formation turned north, their retreat suddenly urgent rather than leisurely. Kestrel steadied her breathing, forced her heart rate down, and led her flight back toward base. Nobody spoke. What she'd just done was either going to earn her a commendation or end her career. They landed as the sun rose, painting the base in shades of gold and amber. Kestrel climbed out of her cockpit to find Commander Price waiting, his face unreadable. Admiral, NORTHCOM is on the line. They want to speak with you immediately. She nodded. I'm sure they do. She'd made her choice. Let the consequences follow. In the operations center, she took the call on speakerphone. The voice on the other end belonged to a four-star general she'd met exactly twice, both times unpleasantly. "Admiral Vance, what the hell were you thinking? You performed unauthorized aggressive maneuvers against Russian military aircraft. You could have started a shooting war. I have the Russian Ministry of Defense calling my office, demanding explanations. What do I tell them?" Kestrel's voice was calm, professional. "Tell them their pilots violated protocols by achieving active targeting locks on American aircraft in international airspace. My maneuver was defensive, designed to break those locks and establish deterrence without actually engaging. Tell them, if they don't want American fighters flying aggressively, they should consider not simulating attacks." Silence on the line. "Then, you're telling me they locked you up first?" Kestrel pulled up the mission data on her tablet. "Yes, sir. I'm forwarding you the radar logs now. 3 separate active targeting radars consistent with weapons guidance systems. Either the Russians were simulating an attack or they were preparing for an actual one. Either way, protocol requires defensive response." I responded. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, the general laughed. "Hell, Vance. 30 years I've been in this job and nobody's ever forced me to call the Russians bluff before. All right, I'll handle the diplomatic side. You handle your pilots. And Admiral, next time you decide to play chicken with a bomber formation, maybe give me a heads up first." The call ended. Kestrel set down the phone and found the entire operations center staring at her. She shrugged. "Back to work, people. Just because we didn't start World War III doesn't mean the day's over." But something had shifted again. Word of the intercept spread through the fleet within hours. The story grew with each retelling. Admiral Widow Vance, the woman who'd stared down Russian bombers and made them blink. The pilot who flew like she had nothing to lose and everything to prove. It wasn't entirely accurate, but Kestrel had learned long ago that legend mattered more than truth in military culture. If her reputation made future adversaries think twice, she'd accept the embellishment. That afternoon, she visited the junior pilot's ready room unannounced. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Cross stood immediately, but Kestrel waved them down. "As you were, I wanted to talk about this morning. You both performed exactly as trained under conditions that would have rattled experienced pilots. I'm putting you both in for commendations." Park looked stunned. "Ma'am, we just followed your lead." Kestrel smiled slightly. "That's exactly what good wingmen do. But following into danger requires just as much courage as leading into it. You stayed calm. You trusted the training. You didn't panic. That's